Hello, I'm Daniel Rosny, and thanks again for your company on It's Raining Men, this weekly deep dive where we try to understand the men behind the thrones that reign over more than 40 countries. All of these monarchs, which happen to all be men, carry out different roles and responsibilities, but the vast majority inherit their power, their privilege, and their position, becoming head of states because of the family they were born into, something that has existed for centuries in many nations. But how, in 2025, are these men continuing to maintain a monarchy's relevance? The 20th century saw royal families deposed around the world, largely as a result of the two world wars. So far, in the 21st century, only two countries have switched from having a monarch to become a republic. In 2001, much of Nepal's royal family was wiped out in a massacre carried out by the heir to the throne, and in the aftermath of those murders, the country abolished the monarchy. In 2021, Barbados removed the British monarch, who was then Queen Elizabeth II, as its head of state, and it now has a president. One of the ways suggested that monarchies are staying relevant is by passing the role down to the next generation. We explored that in the Denmark episode after a shock abdication from Queen Margrethe II there last year. Spain, the Netherlands, Belgium and Japan have all had abdications in the 21st century, and Luxembourg has announced one too. On this episode, we're going to be looking at Henri, the outgoing Grand Duke of Luxembourg. So far on It's Raining Men, we've looked at three kingdoms: Denmark, Sweden and Jordan. Luxembourg isn't a kingdom, and it doesn't have a king, although it does have a monarchy. It's a Grand Duchy, the only one still in the world, and it has a Grand Duke as its monarch. Henri became the first new monarch of the 21st century, taking on the role in October 2000. We're going to find out more about him and his reign as he prepares to abdicate after a quarter of a century. 8 years into his role as Grand Duke, he caused a constitutional crisis by refusing to sign a bill into law using his veto powers. We'll learn how the country and the government reacted and responded, and find out how a report into the royal household 5 years ago called for reform of the monarchy. Before that, though, you might be thinking, where even is Luxembourg? It's a really small country, nestled in between France, Germany and Belgium, and it's around 2,500 square kilometres. It has a population of around 670,000, and it is, according to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the richest country in the world based on its GDP per capita. But to help us understand more about the country's past, we have Sonia Kamex, who's an associate professor in cultural history at the University of Luxembourg, to help guide us. Sonia, hello. What can you tell us about Luxembourg for people who haven't been?
It's characterized mostly by its multilingualism and multiculturalism. So about half of the population are non-nationals, bringing in a really large mix. But the country historically was always characterized by at least two languages, German and French, and the third language, Luxembourg, which grew out of German in a way. So the three languages coexist. So it's a very, culturally diverse place. Not everyone identifies really as Luxembourgish. There are many expats and people who just live here for a couple of years and move on. So a lot of mobility going on. But then the language can be a common identity marker, so that either Luxembourgish or multilingualism, the fact that people do speak many languages, can be seen as unifying. It seems a bit paradoxical, but it does work somehow.
We'll get onto the Grand Duke's role and the history behind it shortly, Sonia, but I wonder, because there's these three cultural identities separated by geography, basically depending on where you are in the country. We've heard in other episodes how a monarch is a unifying figure. So I guess I'm asking, how does Henri manage it when there isn't one identity, even when it comes to the language?
Funnily, I think that the monarchy is more relevant for new arrivals than necessarily for the people who spent here all their life. Well, I cannot generalize that much. Lots of people who come here, really big fans of the monarchy, and often have a more of a romantic image of them than with people who grew up here can sometimes be more critical and even more Republican in some cases.
Henri is a Grand Duke. He's not a king because Luxembourg isn't a kingdom. And it is the only surviving Grand Duchy in the world. But why is it called that?
Well, it was for a long time just a county and then a duchy. And all that was swept away with the French Revolution. So, the old regime crumbled. And in 1815, the Congress of Vienna kind of decided to set up a new state, a really new state in between France and Germany as a buffer state. And that was the Grand Duchy. They called it Grand Duchy and not Duchy, so that the new ruler, who was also King of the Netherlands, would not be diminished when he was sitting in the German Confederation, so that he would not lose his prestige, but still be a Grand Duchy, so royalty. So that was the reason why it was named the Grand Duchy.
But the King of the Netherlands isn't the Grand Duke anymore. That's a different monarchy. It's a different royal family.
King of the Netherlands kind of left in 1890 because he had a daughter, Queen Wilhelmina, and in Luxembourg, daughters were not allowed to succeed at that time to the throne. So that was when a side branch kind of came in from the Nassau-Weilburg line. And they've been living here since, and the family rules were changed so that daughters could also succeed. So there were two female Grand Duchesses, but they have, I think, also changed their name to the Royal House of Luxembourg now.
Yes, because Grand Duchess Charlotte, am I right in thinking that she was one of the most popular monarchs in Luxembourg? And it's often said that she sort of brought the country together.
Yeah, Grand Duchess Charlotte is a very interesting figure. She was Grand Duchess during the Second World War and really became a figurehead because she fled to Portugal and then to the United Kingdom, to the United States, and really was the head of the exile government, so the opposition to the occupying Nazi regime, and she became a figurehead for this kind of free Luxembourg. And for people of that generation and the following generation, she remains a very strong symbol of an independent nation. She has a monument. Charlotte has quite a central monument in the capital city, which is, funnily enough, the rallying point for many demonstrations and, protests against the government. So she's kind of visible in the public space. She's still visible in many people's memories, but I'm not sure if for the young people, for my son, for instance, who's 10, she means anything really. They have the Grand Duke Henri is someone they know, but his grandmother is not that present anymore for that generation.
So that's his grandmother's relationship with the country. But what about Henri himself? He's coming up to 25 years as Grand Duke. What's his relationship like with the population?
I think it's a very positive one. He's a very hearty person, if you can say that, very outgoing, but still shy. So I think he's very much liked. It's a bit more ambiguous. His figure is the Grand Duchess, his wife. She's much more criticized. I think sometimes also maybe unfairly, because they kind of want to rule together as a couple, and that's often criticized. But generally, he's very much, very well liked, I would say.
During his Christmas speech message at the end of last year, he announced that he was stepping down and he was handing the role to his son. Let's just take a short listen to that.
When
I look back today, after almost 25 years, I do so with deep gratitude and humility. It has been a period during which Luxembourg has made much progress, and I'm pleased to have been able to be part of that journey with you, together with the Grand Duchess. It has been a quarter of a century of challenges, opportunities and hopes for a better future, of technological and economic progress, of social change, but also of many conflicts. All were moments that have made us reflect and brought us closer together as a nation. And we've remained united to make Luxembourg even more inviting and sustainable. We have always taken targeted measures to ensure that none of us are left behind or excluded. The strength, and indeed the future of our society, lies in its ability to show solidarity.
Sonia, he gave a 10-month notice period, but abdications are common in Luxembourg, so it wasn't a huge surprise, and his son had already been given some higher responsibilities in preparation for taking on the big job. Now, the country is entering a new era, but what does the monarchy do in 2025, and how are they relevant to a modern society?
Yeah, it's kind of a mascot thing. I think it does give the country a face. It makes it less anonymous. It has this prestige, I guess, historical image that people kind of like, but at the same time, they don't want it to interfere too much in political affairs. So as long as it stays aloof and just on a symbolical level, I think it has this kind of romantic touch.
So I went to school in England, and when you're studying history, you learn about the Tudors, Henry VIII and his wives, the Victorian era, Queen Victoria, the Battle of the Hastings, William the Conqueror. Is history broken up in the same way in Luxembourg, using monarchs as a timestamp?
I think that's a particular British way of looking at things. We don't have the Henry VIIIs or the Charlottean, years. Actually, Luxembourgish history is not taught that much in Luxembourgish schools. So we learn from German and French school books and about the French Revolution and about the Weimar Republic and so on, but not that much about Luxembourgian monarchs.
And looking forward then, away from history, how will the transition of power work? Will it be a big impact on day-to-day life in Luxembourg?
No, I don't think it has a big impact. The idea is that it's a smooth transition, very smooth transition. So announced a long time before, nothing shocking. Grand Duke Guillaume has been introduced to this task over many years. And so really it's about continuity and about not making a big fuss about it as well. I hope it will be a very joyful occasion. I think that's actually, like a retirement party. It can be sad as well, of course. But here it is, a new young person is starting a job. And so he's so far not that well known. So I think there's also lots of curiosity about what's going to change. But in the end, I don't think that much is going to change institutionally. It's planned as a smooth transition, like I said.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Sonia, and giving us a mini history lesson on its reigning men.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you for asking.
As Sonia explained, Luxembourg has a relatively new monarchy, just a little more than 200 years old as a Grand Duchy. Now, I can say this from experience. The castles are great to visit. The small villages surrounding them are like something out of a Hallmark film. And one of my favourite things is Luxembourg is a country that has free public transport for all, which I fully took advantage of on my 2 visits last year, when, of course, I had my trusted microphone with me.
I'm not that kind of a supporter of the Grand Duke.
Yeah, me either. I'm not really like hearing much about him.
Yeah, he doesn't really have representation here in Luxembourg. Nobody really knows anything about him, so yeah.
I mean, when you look at the British royal family, they're everywhere. Is it not the same here?
Oh no, it's like the complete opposite. I think so many people don't really even, they maybe know his name, but they don't even know the name of his wife, so yeah.
There's not really like an exchange of information or near contact to him.
How often do you think about the Grand Duke?
Not that often. No, not really.
What do you think of him as a person?
I don't know, he's really important, but I don't know. I don't really think about him, so I don't know.
Do you think he's important to Luxembourg still?
Probably not as much as he used to be, but he's still important, I think. It's still an image that he represents Luxembourg, so yeah.
Again, thanks to people who speak to me in random cities about their monarchs in a completely non-scientific measure of public opinion. But this time in Luxembourg, I did struggle. And that's because, as you can hear, not many people have a strong opinion of the Grand Duke either way. Most people sort of shrugged their shoulders or said, he exists. I couldn't find huge support for him, but I also couldn't find huge critique either. And it was striking to me that in train stations or in supermarkets, when you're looking at magazines that are on the shelves, most front pages had a picture of a member of the British royal family, the Princess of Wales, or the Spanish, Queen Letizia. The Dutch were featured as well, Queen Maxima, but none of the Luxembourg royals were on the front covers. Now, most of these publications are imported, but it does give a snapshot into the media representation of the monarchy in Luxembourg. And we're going to find out a bit more about that now, as well as 2 big crises under Grand Duke Henri's reign. If you're enjoying the series, Please don't forget to rate us on whatever podcast platform you're using. The role of a monarch is a complicated one as society and the world evolves. Now, most monarchs should be apolitical, but not every system is the same. When Henri became Grand Duke in 2000, he had a power to veto laws passed by the democratically elected government. People didn't think, though, that he would actually want to use it. But in 2008, he did. And he stretched his powers to their limit as he tried to use his veto by refusing to sign a new bill around euthanasia. The bill could only become law with his signature, but he wouldn't put his name to something that he, as an individual, disagreed with. The man and the monarch on this occasion were two completely different entities. Cue constitutional crisis. The Prime Minister at the time had to rush back from a summit to deal with the fallout. It was a really tense time politically. And eventually, after much hard work from lots of different institutions and lots of public debate, the power that the Grand Duke had to veto the law was stripped away, and the constitution was changed so that he couldn't stop a bill becoming law in the future. It was a tricky period for the monarchy, and the stability of the Grand Duke's position was tested. But, as I say, these various factions of government, the royal household, work together in order to find a solution. And like we heard in the previous episode about Jordan, we don't really know what goes on in the castle in the aftermath of what some say is a scandal. The royals in Luxembourg don't have Netflix shows or tell-all autobiographies, but we can hear more about them now in popular culture with Ines Kershaw, a journalist and editor-in-chief of the Luxembourg Vort. It's the oldest newspaper in the country. First of all, Ines, how is the Grand Duke and the royal family covered in Luxembourg?
Yeah, well, they are pretty discreet as a family, so we don't see them so often. The Luxembourg Vort would do, more of the political analysis around the royal family if we have reasons to do so, because, as you said, it's actually a tradition that the whole royal family is more or less discreet affair.
What kind of role does the Grand Duke then have in society in Luxembourg?
Well, if you look at the constitution, so from the constitutional side, he has an influence in the three branches of government. So he participates in the legislative power, he exercises executive power through the government, which is accountable to the parliament. So it's him, that's also there when there is assermentation, when they do the oath on the constitution. The Grand Duke participates in this kind of celebration. It also, the monarch's judicial prerogatives, they include the appointment of judges, but it's actually just, they are nominated through independent body, and then the Grand Duke only confirms this. So he has one extra thing, that is that he has the privilege of granting pardons. But first of all, don't understand the pardons here in the manner of Trump. It's really totally different. It's very rarely that he makes use of this kind of power.
So the three other monarchs that we've looked at so far in the series, they've all got completely different roles in terms of government. So the King of Denmark, I think, is probably quite similar to the Grand Duke of Luxembourg because they still have a position when it comes to the constitution, whereas the Swedish monarch is very symbolic, it's very ceremonial. The King of Jordan, he is the overall person making the decisions. He has a lot of wide-ranging executive powers.
Yeah.
The Grand Duke of Luxembourg used to have a much more prominent role, I guess, in the legislative powers of Luxembourg, but that changed in 2008, didn't it?
Yes, it did. It was actually a big affair. If you want to call it a scandal, you would not be wrong either. Because that was all around the law that was authorizing active euthanasia, I think you call it. The Grand Duke at that time still had the power to, with his signature under a law, confirm and agree with the content. So now, that moment, because he's very Catholic, so he announced that he would not sign the law, and he gave reasons of conscience there. And so the refusal then in the end resulted in a partial disempowerment of the head of state. All the deputies rushed together to put up a constitutional amendment. And now the Article 34, I think, is it, in the Constitution, was amended in that way that the head of the state can only now promulgate laws. I think you call it's promulgation in French. I'm not so sure our laws are written in French, if that's the right term in English. So the right of veto that he had before was removed. So now he just, he signs it, but this signature just means that the procedure itself, the legislative procedure, is done. The law then enters into power, and it has nothing to do with his beliefs or whether he stands behind that particular law or not. When the debate was here, it actually reminded a lot of people of similar situation in Belgium, where I think it was about the abortion law, where the then king also didn't want to sign.
So that was in the early 90s. The king of the Belgians had to sign a law that would legalize abortion in Belgium. But I think for a period of 24 or 48 hours, the government deemed him unfit to rule. They then passed the law, and then they deemed him fit to rule again. So it prevented him from vetoing or stopping the law from passing. And a similar example happened in the Netherlands shortly after World War II, where the then Queen wouldn't sign a law based on her conscience that would sentence convicted Nazi members to death. Instead, they served lifetime sentences in prison. But I guess the question is, why did the state of Luxembourg still believe that it was the right function of society to carry on with a monarchy if it wasn't doing what it was supposed to do?
Well, that's actually a good and pertinent question. I think it was the first time that also deputies and politicians were confronted, by this kind of gap between the parliament and then a head of state. Nobody really likes to talk about it so much. I think the parliament at that point was a little bit caught in the cold because they hadn't really expected him to block that, because it was already a very difficult process to get this law through. The Conservative Party at that time was against it, but they gave a free vote so that deputies could vote according to their conscience. And they also had people, that were actually not voting against it, but Conservatives voting pro, and it created quite a discussion in society. If you want Parliament to be taken seriously, of course, you needed some clarification in the roles. Also, actually he was considered, from the public, he was considered more in his representative roles. They never even, discussed much, what does this signature actually mean? And one thing was clear. In our constitution, we have a role for the Grand Duke. We don't have a role of the Grand Duchess, even though that she's a very determined, and some people might say, she's not only determined, but she's also a very influential person when it comes to her husband. And that also, created some kind of uncertainty that the institutions cannot really handle. And in the constitutional reform that they then passed in 2023, there was another one. There was the new constitution that they put in place. You will find that there is no role for the Grand Duchess, not even a representative role mentioned in the constitution. I personally think that we still have not really digested this kind of coup, whatever you want to call it. It's not a military coup, of course, but this kind of conflict, because it's a conflict that runs deep also in the society of this very traditional Catholic side, and then all the progressivism that comes, with being a modern financial hub and all that in Europe, one of the founding members in the EU. So yeah, it's a pretty strong tension there.
That was the first big crisis in his reign, but fast forward 12 years to 2020. So only 5 years ago, there was this government commissioned report into the workings of the royal household, from everything from finances to recruitment to turnover of staff. And am I right in saying that it essentially called for major reform in the monarchy of Luxembourg?
That is right. So the Grand Duchess Maria Teresa, she redefined the role of herself, and she longed more for public attention. What is true, she's a special character, so she does a lot of, you would say, philanthropic work. Like, for example, she has this foundation where she cares for women that are confronted with war crimes, like mostly sexual war crimes, and I think she does some good work there. But at the same time, she's also demanding person, and she's a demanding person to the inside. So there were a lot of stories circulating how she was treating her personnel in the palace. And it went so far, that people left the workplace because of burnout, this kind of burnout syndrome that they had. And also there was problem about the attribution of money. Was it for public courses? Was it for private courses? And since, Henri was always a little bit, some call him that he's very much in love with his wife. Others say he was too weak to set the strict borders as foreseen in the constitution. So whatever interpretation you want to follow, in the end, the then liberal government under the leadership of Xavier Bettel did this report with a special counselor, and he found, yes, there were some dysfunctionalities around the personnel, also around the financial structure that they had. So it was the moment actually to bring in some more transparency, and that's why they then put up the Maison Grand-Duc, it's called. And now they have to follow, this kind of annual report, and things are also audited. That wasn't the case before. It was a bit of a black box. Sometimes you would know, and journalists would be very happy if they found out something, what did this cost? What did that cost? But it was not really laid down in a proper budget. And now they are obliged to be more transparent about their expenses and their travelings and all that.
And even though the series is called It's Raining Men, it's profiling the men born into power. But this report was such a big story in Luxembourg. I do have to ask about the language that's used around it, because she's a powerful woman. She knows what she wants. She's very driven. There were some accusations that some of it was misogyny.
Yeah, well, that's a claim that actually Henri came up with. He went public and defended his wife and called it a certain type of, sexism, the way that she was treated mainly by the press. Well, I would say I have a more differentiated, a nuanced way of looking at it, because, you say rightly, she's driven. She's also really driven by public opinion. She likes to be outside, and she does sometimes claim functions that she does not have. She has no real representative role. Nonetheless, she's very much open. Now, when it comes to the 25th anniversary of the throne, of Henri's throne, very curious to see if she herself demands a role there, because she should not have it. But I'm sure that every preparation that they're doing and entering right now, I cannot imagine that this is done without Maria Teresa's approval. So yeah, behind every famous and strong man, you probably find a strong woman as well,
You mentioned the 25th anniversary that is coming up. Grand Duke Henri has chosen to abdicate, and he will step down from the throne one day before his 25th anniversary. But this is normal for Luxembourg. It's not like Denmark, where it was a huge shock last year when the Queen abdicated there. That hadn't happened in 900 years. In Luxembourg, every generation passes it down. They retire, don't they?
Yes, they do retire. It's not such a unusual thing to do. The same was the case with Henri. He followed when both of his parents were still alive, and Grand-Duc Jean at that time also was still in power. I also think, he was never really at ease with these kind of representative functions that come with his role. It's interesting. His personality is actually a personality that is more introspect. Not such an extrovert personality as is Maria Teresa. She's got Cuban origin, so she's really very present. And when you're with her, she's very charming, She can convince people easily. And you can see, he's not really that comfortable with talking in these kind of protocols that he has to talk with. What I find interesting is also he sticks very much to the protocol. So, for him it's prison, but he never really also dared, probably because of the experience around 2008, he never really dared after that to leave protocol. And his son, who comes, who has part of his father in him and also of his mother, it will be really interesting to see how this kind of modernization, through a change of throne will come into place. I'm very curious to see that. Already there are, some kind of little indicators that the son probably will be doing things differently.
Well, if this series is still running in October, we'll have another man to profile, because the next monarch of Luxembourg is a man. Unlike your neighbours in Belgium, where the air there is female. So there are women to come as monarchs, but just not in Luxembourg. Ines, thank you so much for giving us a bit of an insight into the media around the royal family in Luxembourg, and also explaining those two big crises that has happened in his reign.
Yeah, I loved being on your podcast. I wish you good luck, and I hope you will find more stories to tell. It's fascinating, I think, to look into the different ways also of the monarchies, because they are very different, that's true.
Well, if you're like Ines and fascinated by monarchies and royal families in 2025, there's more to come. We're working hard on the next few episodes. A reminder, our email is itsreigningmenpod@gmail.com if you want to get in touch or have any questions for future editions. And we are collating some that's already in the inbox and looking at a Q&A episode in the future. That's it for Luxembourg for now. But who knows, we may be back at the end of the year for another edition of this podcast. Thank you for listening to It's Raining Men. If you enjoyed it, please tell your friends who also might be interested in kings, queens, power and palaces. And it would be great if you could subscribe so more episodes appear in your feed as soon as they're ready. And if you want to suggest a topic to be explored or have any questions about monarchies or specific members of royal families, you can find us on social media. Just search It's Raining Men. There's also a weekly newsletter on Substack too. Speak soon.